Hello everyone and welcome to my studio. It's time for another demo, and today I'm going to help solve a problem that many of us have when it comes to painting trees. Alright, so have you ever painted a tree and you got really involved in painting the leaves? Now I know this happens to me a lot. I call it Filiosis. That's a word that I made up, and it really means too many leaves. And I find myself when I'm painting trees that I put in a few leaves and I can't stop. So I put in a few more and I put a few more, and before I know it, I've got this really spotty looking painting that all of a sudden the trees have no form, they have no shape, they're so busy, we don't really know where to look, and it's just overwhelming. So I know that I would prefer to have more suggestion in my paintings. In other words, paint a big shape and then suggest a few of the leaves. Alright, so that's the power of suggestion. So I'm going to show you how I accomplish this, how I avoid Filiosis in the demo that I'm going to do today. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so here's our subject today. We have a nice small, kind of blurry, not the best photo. Okay, that's tip number one. If I'm working from a photo where I can't see every leaf on the tree, then I'm not going to be tempted to paint every leaf on the tree. So when I paint from something that I've blown up and I can see every detail, I'm too tempted to put in all the detail that I see. So working from a small kind of out of focus photo works really well to help keep things simple. Alright, the second tip that I'm going to give you is you want to start with big, simple shapes. So we aren't going to paint every leaf, we're going to just paint the overall shape of the tree, and then towards the end of the painting we'll paint a few leaves, and the idea is the viewer's mind will fill in the rest. In other words, you see a few leaves, then you can deduce that that's a tree and the type of tree it is by the type of leaf marks that you make. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So we're going to do a wet underpainting. I want to just say this right before I get started, that I paint fairly quickly and usually can finish a painting in 30 minutes or less. But every painting I do seems to go through an ugly stage around 10 or 15 minutes into the painting. And so I know a lot of times people give up on that point. They get to the point and they see what I'm doing and they say, oh no, nothing's going to happen here, and they move on. But I really want to encourage you to stick with me to the end of the video, and hopefully that's when the transformation will take place, towards the latter half of the video. So stick with me on that. And one other thing, if you like what you see, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe and do all that. Interacting with this video really helps present it to more artists, and I would really appreciate your help with that. Alright, let's get started. Let's look first at the materials that I'm going to use for the underpainting. You were looking at the paper, and I'm using a 8x10 sheet of LuxArchival sanded paper. It only comes in white. It does not buckle when you do a wet underpainting. And I'm going to just do a very simple, straightforward alcohol wash wet underpainting. I'm going to be using an assortment of hard pastels, and this is the Nupastels brand, and I'll talk about the colors I'm using. And then I'm going to use some regular rubbing alcohol. This is 70% isopropyl rubbing alcohol to liquefy the pastel, and I'm going to be using an inexpensive child's paintbrush by Princeton Company, and I just like these are inexpensive because they get ruined by the sanded paper, but they do a good job of helping move the paint around, and that's what you're going to get when you liquefy pastel. You're going to get paint. Alright, back to the drawing board here, and the first thing I'm going to do is just very lightly draw in my big simple shapes. So we have a collection of trees in their autumn splendor. It's nice golden, orangey, yellow tree shapes. And so there seems to be one, two, maybe, yeah, there's three of them. So 3 is a good number. So I'm going to basically just look at my photo, keep it simple for the demo today. I'm not going to do much as far as changing the composition. although that is something that I always encourage you to do, is to make a plan and make a more interesting composition. But for this demo, we're just talking about painting trees without painting too many leaves. Alright, so we have our main trees here. We've got to ground them a little bit. I want to make sure the spacing in between them are unequal. So we have these two and then we have a larger space in between. Let's pull a branch over here so it connects those shapes. We can have a few trunks over on this side, but I'm not going to pay too much attention. And then we have some trees that are in the distance, so that'll help kind of set the scene for this painting. We have in the reference photo a large cloud shape. I may or may not put it in. It is something that I can add, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. Alright, now the big simple shapes are lightly drawn in with pencil, and what I'm going to do now is use those hard pastels to create one layer of color over the entire painting. Now, how do you decide what colors you're going to put in your underpainting? That is a huge topic, underpainting colors and underpainting techniques. But I'm going to just, for today's demo, not get into the whole underpainting question, but rather just keep it simple. And I'm going to just block it in with shapes that are similar to the local colors that I see. That's just an easy approach. There's so many different ways you can approach underpainting colors. But that's for more lessons and more videos. So what I did first was a dark blue for those really dark trunks, and I grounded them by putting in some dark, actually there's a nice shadow shape right in here. So there's nice dark to ground those tree trunks. Now I'm going to paint the overall shape of these trees, and I'm using a kind of dull orange. You might call it a burnt orange. And I want to make sure that the shapes of these trees are interesting, right? So we don't want big lollipop shapes. We want interesting shapes of foliage and big simple shapes, because what are we going to do? We're going to gradually add more detail, but we want to start with big simple shapes. Now I'm adding those trees that are in the distance, and I'm using kind of a dull olivey green because I want a dull, lighter color for those distant trees. I'm looking to see where some of that foliage might be a little bit darker. And by the way, I'm using the edge of the pastel, not the tip, to paint these large areas. I think the interior here of these trees are a little bit darker. Alright, what about our sky color? I love the blue, I love the rich blue of the sky, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually put a really dark value blue sky, but I know that if I paint it this dark, it's going to look like nighttime or twilight. So I'm going to have to get it a little bit lighter as the painting progresses, but that is something that we can adjust once we start adding the softer pastel layers. Now I'm just adding kind of a light golden yellow for the foreground grasses. And I'm going to just come in here with a little bit of a lighter, brighter yellow so that I can kind of get a nice mixture. There's also a nice yellow-green bush shape down at the base of the trees, so that might be interesting. I think I'm going to take this dark brown and pull that dark area all the way to the foreground, so that will really allow my trees to not feel like they're just floating in the ground. So now the wet part, the underpainting, the liquefying of the pastel, the alcohol wash. I'm going to just dip my brush into rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to use a little paper towel so that it's not too wet and drippy. And I'm going to start by wetting down or painting over the lightest areas first. The reason why I do the lightest areas first is because it is hard to keep your alcohol perfectly clean. So if you start with those darker colors, you might end up with a whole collection of dark colors unless you're constantly cleaning out your alcohol. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make my brush strokes, paint them the way I might paint my pastel marks. So this is foliage. I'm using kind of random back and forth strokes to indicate how that foliage or that those trees might look. So in other words, I'm not going back and forth like I was painting a wall. What I'm doing is making use of the idea that my pastel is becoming paint, liquid pigment. And so I'm using a brush to paint. So if you guys are used to painting in another medium with a brush, doing a wet underpainting for pastel is a good way to ease into it. And really take your time with this underpainting part because it really does give you a head start on your painting. And it's going to also simplify your trees. Remember, we're trying to avoid Filiosis, that dreaded disease of putting in too many leaves. And so if we can start with big simple shapes, it's almost as if we were cheating. The other fun thing that I like about a wet wash is the unexpected things that might happen with them. So we have some interesting drips happening over here in these distant trees. It looks like we even have some tree trunks happening. And I'm going to come in. So I love doing a wet underpainting, not only because it simplifies things, but it creates, or it has the potential to create, some interesting effects. And that makes it fun. And if we can have fun when we paint, that's half the battle of having success. If it's drudgery, then we're not going to want to do it very often. So if I can find ways to make it fun, I'm going to make it fun. I'm just going to kind of soften the edges of those tree shapes. And it's okay if the sky drips into my distant trees. Oh, I've got everything blocked in. I realized when I looked down that I wanted to put a little purple in. So guess what you can do? You can actually come in on top of this wet pastel and add some of that harder pastel. And if you want to liquefy it, go right ahead and add a little bit more rubbing alcohol. Why purple? Well, I know I'm going to have a lot of yellow in the trees and in the grasses, and purple being the complement of yellow will hopefully make the yellow areas more exciting and more interesting. So that's why I added purple. Alright, so we're going to let this dry. Once it's dry, say in maybe 30 minutes or less, we'll come back to it and we'll get started with the soft pastel. Alright, we are back. The underpainting is dry, and we have a nice flat piece of paper. There was no buckling involved. We have some interesting drips, but the main point of doing the alcohol wash this time was to fix the color in place. So you see, as I run my finger over these areas, the pastel doesn't come off. That means I have a really nice base to build the painting on, to start adding more layers. And I will say this, doing the alcohol wash does affect the paper in a little, at the slightest. So you will notice the paper is going to feel a little bit different than it did without anything. Because after all, you are adding a layer of pigment. But because that dark layer, or the layers, are now fixed in place, you're going to have the ability to add more pastel layers on top. Alright, first thing I do with soft pastel is I come in and I reinforce the dark areas. And I should show you my palette before I even get started. Just kind of pan down and give a look. What I did was I selected some of pastels out of my large studio box, and what you'll find here is a mixture of Terry Ludwig and Diane Townsend's soft form pastels, which are two of my favorite pastels to use. I've got a variety of values, and I select my pastels based upon what element I'm going to use them for. So we have dark areas, light areas, and then the tree colors, distant tree colors, and all the green stuff. And as simple as that. Alright, so I'm going to reinforce the dark areas, starting with a dark value blue pastel. So the dark areas are the shadow shapes under the trees, as well as those really nice dark trunks. And at this stage, I can actually spend a little bit more time developing the gesture of those trunks, so I don't want them to all look like, let's kind of tilt this guy over a little bit so we have a little variety. And then we have this guy here can be a little bit thicker. So again, we want to have a variety of shapes and sizes, and we can throw in a few of the smaller branches, just make some smaller marks with the pastel. What about the dark trunk over on the right hand side? We're just going to hint at a few of those trunks, and then I'm going to pull this dark shape over just a little bit more, try to make it an interesting silhouette. And I'm going to pull that dark down very lightly to this foreground area just to anchor all of these shapes. So I'm also going to come into my dark areas with another dark value pastel, because I like to have variety in my darks. So here is a dark burgundy, red violet rather, more of a red violet. And I'm just going to come over the tree trunks and these shadow shapes with that red violet. Now, the tree trunks probably have a little bit of darker green in them, kind of a darker brownish. So I'm coming in with a dark value, kind of a brownish green color. The idea here is, again, just to have interesting color in those dark shapes. Now, I do have what I call my super dark, and that's the Terry Ludwig eggplant. And that's, if you've been doing pastel for a while, or even not, you've probably heard about this famous eggplant. It's just a really nice rich dark, and I like to reserve it for just the highlights or the accent marks. So like really, where's the darkest darks? At the base of the tree and kind of in a little bit of the trunk areas. But I don't want to put it everywhere because it's just too dark and too intense, and it will really loses its impact if you use it everywhere. Alright, so we have our dark areas in place. The next thing that I like to do usually is do the sky, because it sets the tone, sets the mood, the feeling of the whole painting. But actually, before I do that, I'm going to give one layer to my tree shapes, because then I'll know where I want to bring the sky. So I'm looking at the tree shapes, and I want to start a little bit darker than I want them to end up. So we've got some nice yellow-orange tree shapes, and I will eventually get to that color. But I'm going to first do a very light layer of this dark yellow, which is we might call brown, but that's really what it is. And I'm using a very light touch. So one of the things I like to remind myself when I paint is the right touch is a light touch, because if I can do a light touch and still see what is underneath, then I know I have the ability to add more layers. I see a really nice kind of yellowy green brown in here as well. I'll add just a little bit of that. The other thing that I want to address before I do the sky rather, are the distant trees. So the distant trees are going to be a little bit lighter and duller. So I'm using this kind of dusty mauvey brown color to represent trees in the distance. And we will modify this, but this is just to get us started. And I'm sneaking it, as you can see, back behind the trees, because we can see part of the what's behind these trees. They're not as dense as, you know, they're not like a solid wall, let's just say. All right, I think that's good. That's enough information. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the sky. Now remember, in the underpainting stage, I started with this really dark value, rich, bright blue. And I said, well, you know, yeah, that's what I saw out there, but we have to be careful because if we paint it this dark, it might look like a twilight scene. It might look too dark. So this is what I'm talking about. Look how dark that looks. To me, it feels a little dark and heavy and almost, like I say, the twilight effect. So what I'm going to do is put it in, but I'm going to go over it with a lighter value blue, just to modify it a little bit. I don't want it to be quite as dark, although it is beautiful. Remember we talked about not sure what to do about the cloud shape. I don't think I'm going to put it in right now. It is something I can add at the end. I'm coming now in with a nice light or middle value blue violet. It's the same value as what I just put up in the sky, but it just adds a little variety to the sky color. And I'm also using it to start to carve into my tree shape to give it a little air, little sky holes. I think once I read someone say, make sure you don't forget holes for the birds to fly through. So that's something you can keep in mind. And I'm going to use a warmer blue as I approach the horizon or the tops of the trees here. And right now, put some on this side, there is not enough, it's not, trying to think of my words as I'm trying to make a decision. It's not blended enough, right? So it's a parfait. We don't want a parfait. So I'm using that second blue that I used to kind of knit these areas together, right? And just to kind of pull them all together. And then I also want it to be a little bit warmer at the horizon. And we do see these cloud banks. So I'm using a pale peach right here at the horizon. And it kind of does look like some of those clouds billowing up. So that kind of works. Alright, so now we have our sky shape, our darks in place, the beginning of the tree color. I'm going to put a little something down here on the ground, and then we'll continue working on the trees. So I'm going to put a little dirt color. And to me, a dirt color is a color that I know is going to be interesting as a base color for what I'm going to put on top of it. So in other words, I see it as like golden grasses, but I don't want to just go in right away with the golds. I kind of wanted to ease into it and make it a little bit more interesting. So the color underneath the golds will be this nice rusty brown color, and hopefully that will make it a little bit more interesting when I go ahead and add the grasses. I'll just put a few in just to see some of that yellowy gold, and that does make it a little bit more interesting. Alright, so let's do a little bit more to connect the grass to these distant trees. And remember, these are in the distance and they have to be duller and lighter. So here's a nice dull, neutralized green. If this were a summer landscape, I would use a blue-green for these trees, but these trees have fall color in them, right? So we don't want them to be blue-green because they're warm. But how do we make warm go in the distance? Well, we can use duller or more neutral versions of our warm color. Just trying to give a little bit more interest to that silhouette and put down some more of that sky color. So a little blue and then back to the peach. Alright, now we can address our tree shapes. What's going on here? We've got this weird shape that is kind of a bush that's in the shadows of these trunks. I'm going to come in with a little bit of a really nice dark green and just kind of reinforce all these dark areas in the shadows. a little bit over in this area as well. All right, now let's turn on the lights to the trees. Now remember, the whole premise of this video is to avoid Filiosis, or painting every single leaf on the tree. So in order for me to not paint every leaf on the tree, I'm going to use the side of my pastel to make my marks. So instead of making little dots everywhere, I'm going to make broad strokes. And I'm starting also with a color that is a little bit lighter than what's already there. And I don't want to cover up that darker brown everywhere. I mean, I don't want to cover it all up because then everything's going to look flat. So I'm using a very light touch in some areas and I'm pressing down a little bit harder in other areas. And now this is the point in time where I'm trying to pay attention to this whole shape of the tree. So we want interesting outlines, right? We want to come in with our sky holes. What's happening down in here? We want there to be volume, so again, we don't want to cover all of the dark areas up, or else it's going to look flat. And we don't want to get carried away with too many different marks. All right, this tree shape down here in the shadows is, we have to break it up a little bit more. Ooh, there's a little bit of white stuck in my pastel. What is that? But look what it did. It made little fireworks. I'm just going to change that a little bit. It was a little bit too just dark and flat looking. And then move some of that over here. There is a little indication of some yellowy green trees down here at the base. So I'm going to just add a few of those in. I'm letting the underpainting peek through in some of these places because that alcohol wash underpainting was quite interesting. All right, let's now keep going. We want to introduce a little bit more interest to our trees, so I'm changing a color, but not really the value, so it might be a little bit hard to tell. But I'm using, this was more of a orangey. Now I'm putting in a little bit more of a yellowy green, but it's the same value as what's already there, so it's not making a huge jump. That's the other tip I want to offer you is, if you don't want to paint every leaf on the tree, try to keep your value range limited and change your colors instead. So changing the color or the temperature of the color is going to make it more, it will make it interesting without it being spotty. It gets spotty when we start to change the values too much, and then you have too many spots of light and dark, right? And you don't want that. Also, I'm using the side of my pastel to create broad marks rather than small, picky little marks. All right, I'm going to come back in. I'm going to pull out my hard pastels again. Remember, we started with the hard pastels, and we're going to use them again, and I'm going to use them to come in and to do a little bit of line work here and kind of reinforce some of the trunks and branches where we've lost them. And I like to do this before I put the final touches on the painting because I want to cover up some of these lines. I don't want them all to be like sitting on top of the foliage. That wouldn't look very natural. But if I put them in now and then go and cover them up, that actually will work. So I'm using the dark blue to come in and create some linear marks. This is kind of a boring area, so let's throw it in a little bit of a trunk here and another one right in here. So even towards the very end of the painting, I'm making some decisions in composition to hopefully make it more interesting. The other thing is we could use some indication of trunks back here in the distance, but I don't want them to be as dark. Let's see if that works. Ooh, that's a nice blue-gray. That works for the dark areas. All right, I'm going to take a minute. I'm going to step back so that I can come back and make those final marks. Okay, so Stepping away is always a good thing because you start to see things that need to be adjusted, and then you work with more purpose instead of just keep going and making all these marks. That's when I tend to get carried away with all the leaves, when I don't step back. So I stepped back and I realized a couple of things, and I made I'm going to make those adjustments. One thing I already did was I smoothed out the sky, because to me it was just too busy, too many, I could see too many colors peeking through from the underpainting, and this is busy enough. So I just used my finger, very lightly blended the sky, and came back with fresh pastel. And I added a little touch of more yellow to the cloud bank or lower horizon. So what I need to do now is finish the grassy area and then add a little bit more color to our trees. They're not really yellow, they're more of an orangey yellow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out my set of Sennelier Paris half stick sets, and I like to use these at the end of a painting. They're softer than the Terry Ludwig's, and they are really nice for those final marks. So I've selected a peachy version to add some of that peachy color into these tree shapes. Again, I'm using the side of this pastel at this moment and just using a fairly light touch so that I don't want to cover up everything that's there. I just want to add to it. Oops. The issue sometimes with these pastels is if they're not completely flattened out, they can make some stray marks that you might not want. So it sometimes helps to have a piece of paper near your easel so that you can straighten out the ones that are kind of crooked. Here's a nice yellowy gold color I'm going to add down here at the bottom. There's some greeny, kind of yellowy green areas down here near the grasses that I can put some of those marks in. And at this point, when I look at it, I say, okay, I don't have a lot of the fussy leaves, but we need a little bit more definition. So let's go ahead and do the grasses, and then we'll come in and do the final marks. We'll make a few leaf shapes. Remember, suggest, and then let the viewer do the rest. So let's get some of this gold color and use the side of the pastel to make a few grassy marks. And here, let's add another golden yellow to it. If I want to get a little bit more detailed, then I will take out a hard pastel. Here's a yellow, and come in and do a little bit of scribble to get some nice linear grass marks. I really want to break up this dark area. I like the dark area in the shadow, but it has an odd shape. So I'm using the grass to break it up a little bit more. Alright, let's make those final marks. Let's make those leaf marks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a few leaves in where I really want you to look. Right? So think about how you're going to lead the viewer's eye through this tree. So where is the light hitting the tree? Where do we have a little bit of shift in the foliage? So I'm using a combination of that got a little bit too heavy right there. I'm going to have to adjust that. It works real well if you put some leaf shapes on the edges, you know, where they might be kind of hanging off the branches just a little bit. And maybe we've got some darker ones over in the shadowed areas. But I'm going to use the side of the pastel and then just put out a few of these little marks at the edges of the tree. This is the part where I have to be very careful, because this is the part where I will get carried away if I don't stop myself. So what I like to do when I am working on these finishing leaf marks is put in a few leaf marks and then step back. Put in a few more and step back. So I need some kind of to pull your eye down into the grassy area, and I'm going to put a few little, oops, that one's a little bigger than I wanted. I'm going to put a few little yellow leaves down here so that your eye goes here, and then we want to bring the eye up the side of the tree so that we can get involved in the tree. I see that the trunk shape seems to be a little bit odd. I'm going to take a bright blue and just add it to the trunk, just to add just a little tiny bit of interest in those trunks, kind of like eye candy. So you know, we don't see them right away, but if we keep looking, then we start to notice interesting little color in our trunks. And again, I can, well, I want to really break up that space right there. The important thing for me to do now, again, is to step back and evaluate and not get carried away. And I always like to say this, I'm ending a painting on this note. It's not always what you put in or add that makes a painting good or rescues it. It's sometimes what you take away. So, you know, I might take away some of the foliage, or I might put in some sky holes that will kind of eliminate some of the thicker foliage. So right now I'm coming in with the sky color, breaking up those big areas to give it a little bit more air and a little bit more interest. And if you find that you have too much going on and you ended up getting carried away with your leaf shapes, a brush is going to be your friend. Go in there and brush a few out. The other thing you can do is get some sort of sharp tool. It can be a pin. I'm using a banker's clasp, or you can use a palette knife, but you can come in and scrape away some of the thicker passages of pastel, and that again takes away. Not always what you add, but it's what you take away to simplify things and avoid that spottiness. I think I need a little bit more brighter leaves over on this side of the tree, or on this other tree. So I'll just go in and put in a few leaf marks here, and then stop, because I'm going to get carried away. That's just what we want to avoid. And I'm going to call it finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, this whole idea of Filiosis. Don't be afraid of trees, but approach them with big, simple shapes and then gradually add the detail. And that way you have more control over how many leaves you do add. And I'll leave you with this thought: suggest and let the viewer do the rest. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. And I would invite you to join me over on Patreon. Become a Patreon insider, and there's lots more lessons and demos like this one. But I thank you for taking the time, and I will see you next time.